Welcome to the Rant Live.
Yes, so we are one day past the trade deadline. Yesterday was Tuesday, August 2nd. So, there was a lot of activity that went down. Not quite as much activity as we would have expected for the Cubs on the Cubs side. Kind of surprising, and we'll definitely dive right into that. But at the end of the day, I mean, the Cubs end up making 5 trades, if you count the trade they made with the Giants, which was a swap of minor leaguers. 5 trades, four major league trades that you'd hope would have some level of impact. And we'll just go down the line. They traded on Saturday. They traded Chris Martin, reliever, to the Dodgers for Zach McKinstry, utility guy with doesn't feel like a lot of upside there. I think he's had plenty of opportunity in Los Angeles to kind of get going, and he never has. Now, of course,
well, I'd say he hadn't had much opportunity in LA. He's been in their system for a while. I would say he strikes me as more of a wisdomy Schwindeli without the power kind of. He's been blocked up at LA. I'll say that, but I don't think it's much of an impact. I think he's a good bench depth guy, but.
Yeah, exactly. And we had exchanged texts saying that, we felt like this was the type of guy, kind of role player, utility guy that the Cubs really needed back in 2017, 18, and 19. And it seems like they're loaded with those kind of guys now. It's like
they have those. They don't have the guys that they're supposed to fill in. They had the stones and no mortar. Now they got a whole lot of mortar and no stones.
Yeah, they just can't seem to get that right. So it's like, it's like trying to find that right mix of guys who are kind of have star power, so to speak, who are, kind of well-rounded players. And then you can supplement them with these utility guys. And so it's like, back in 17 through 19, it just didn't seem to be able to fill in those utility roles very well at all. And now they're doing a great job of that, but unfortunately they have a team full of utility kind of guys, and that doesn't really work real well if you're trying to compete in the major leagues. So moving on, they acquired Hayden Wesneski, starting pitcher prospect at AAA, currently has not played in the majors for Scott Effross. I think that caught a lot of people off guard.
Us included, definitely caught us. It happened right in the middle of our last show.
Yeah,
we had no idea what the hell was happening.
Yeah, that was interesting. It was definitely the news broke right as we were recording the show on, was it Monday? Yeah, Monday. And it was surprising because it's not a rookie who's got 5 years more control. You just don't expect to see him traded. I think looking at the trade though, it's and knowing what the Cubs bullpen looks like, trying to separate ourselves from the kind of the personal side of it, because unfortunately you've got to do that in baseball. It looks like it could be a good trade, but who knows? It's a prospect for a guy who's proven himself at the major league level. Yeah. And that's always a tough route to go. I would have liked to have seen the Cubs get at least another guy back in return in addition to Wesneski, but because they were trading a guy who's going to be able to step in, and Effross, and should be able to help the Yankees down the stretch here and into the playoffs.
Yeah, so I want to address that and I know we'll get to the other ones, but it was really odd because it's fun. Here's the problem with Twitter sometimes too, is like people choose to interpret things the way they want to, and it was like in the wake of that, and my thought is Effross is a guy. And here's part of it is I want the Cubs to be a contending team. I know they are not, but there's a reason a team like the Yankees would acquire a player like that with several years of control, is because they expect to win. A winning team willingly gave up, right? Because everybody's like, well, this guy could be a starter. I'm like, you said this guy what? Well, could be. Oh, okay. Well, this other guy is, right? So, but that's why the Yankees want this guy. The Cubs, again, in giving up a very viable, potentially long-term bullpen piece, and not a guy like everybody's like, well, relievers are volatile. Yeah, a lot of that is because you had a guy who all of a sudden spiked up to like 98, 99 with his velo, right, and discovered a new pitch or something like that, or all of a sudden came out of nowhere. right? Like a reliever who has a defined set of skills, and Afros with the arm angle and everything else, I think has that, right? It's not like he's some guy who relies on this elite velo that'll fall off. And, so I said, listen, I think Wisniewski could end up being very good. That's what I led with. That's the funny part. So it's like, he could end up being very good. So my problem with assessing a trade like that is like all these people are like, oh, this guy was a number 7 ranked prospect in the Yankee system. It's a win for the Cubs. Like, if you're judging a trade just based on the rank in one service of the prospect the Cubs got back, I don't think you're doing it right. You know what I mean? Like, if you provide context around it and you explain, you say, here's why I feel like this is a good deal for them. But I had people, there were all these people like, Cubs win the trade. Like, they didn't win shit. In fact, as of now, as you immediately view it, they lost it because they're sending a guy who was contributing to them and who is now contributing to a winning team. And what they got back is a guy who is not actually contributing to the Cubs yet. You can't say anybody won or lost it until you look down the road. And that's the problem I had. And all these people got really shitty about that. And I'm like, if all you're doing is valuing potential over production, there's two things there. One is I think that's dumb. Purely rating it that way, right? We can always look at things in hindsight. We can see how that works. We can apply context to it. But that's my other problem is a team like the Yankees, what are they valuing right now? They are valuing production because they're a winning ball club. The Cubs are still valuing, as we're seeing in most of these trades, still valuing the potential. And they have to. The issue, again, with that is that we know the Cubs suck right now. But my problem with that was, like, they were able to get, and everyone's like, well, he's 4 years younger with this. Like, okay, cool. he's younger. Great. I mean, like, it's a pitcher. There's still, the likelihood of getting hurt, whatever. Anyway, it's just my look at viewing things. And I think this is where people, and then people get way bent out of shape because they thought I was like subtweeting them or something. Like, no, I'm just saying you cannot just look at a number and be like, oh, that's a win for the Cubs, unless it's like, okay, David Robertson. Well, who the hell needs a closer who's only signed through the end of the year if your team is shit? Yeah, I mean, you get back anything. They got back a Ben Brown or whatever. I think that was a really good one. I apologize if I'm stepping on what you're about to cover, but it's just, anyway.
You're just getting in front of it.
No, it just bothered me, but it was. I pulled up MLB.TV and I watched Efros. He looked a little, almost gave up a homer, his first batter. And there's some great. If you go out there and look at, he's got some great facial expressions. You can go out there and check out the look that he made. It was just, ooh.
Yeah, I retweeted that from. I think it was from Talking Yanks. There was
and he ended up getting out of the inning and everything, but it was. Again, I just go back to this, and I think, I understand where the Cubs are in the process. But when you're serving as the feeder team to the Yankees, when you're saying, man, we've got this guy, this is a guy, the New York effing Yankees with the best record in baseball. They want this guy to be a stalwart in their bullpen. Okay. And he's got 5 years of control. It worries me a little, and fully understanding that the Cubs have proven the ability to build a bullpen. They've got some guys coming up and arms and all that, right? That they don't want a guy, or that they were able to get rid of a guy or willing to get rid of a guy with that much control left who could have, and we've talked about this before, you have guys, if you can plug them in, you say, this is a fit. We know he's holding this spot right here. That's one spot we don't need to worry about. And the fact that he's doing that at a very, very low rate payment-wise, part of that just kind of sticks in my craw a little bit, especially when there weren't other moves that were made with more quote unquote expendable players. And I hesitate to say it that way, but again, with guys who have a decreasing amount of overall value in terms of whether it be their age or their contractual control or whatever. So sorry to go off on that rant, but I just wanted to clarify everything for like the 50th time about kind of how I view these things.
I have the feeling that this is not going to be the last time you're going to need to clarify those things, unfortunately. Probably not. Knowing how social media works. So, so I mean, the Cubs who knows who their closer is going to be, because anyone that was in the bullpen that even had a remote chance of being their closer is gone. David Robertson to the Phillies for Ben Brown, 22-year-old prospect. I think that was a solid trade. 37-year-old guy on a 1-year deal in Robertson. And then Mikael Givens to the Mets for Saul Gonzalez. A big guy, real big guy. 6'7", like
280. I think he's an absolute unit.
So a lot of upside. It seems like the Cubs are going with those kind of bigger framed, kind of power arm guys, which it's not a surprise that they're doing that, right? Because they don't have those guys. They don't really have any of those guys on their team right now.
Yeah.
If you start talking about power arms, and that was the one thing that they said they needed, we felt like maybe they would go and get a power arm in the free agent market. Instead, they want to try to develop a power arm, I guess. So that's kind of the path they're taking. So
I suppose.
Yeah. And it's like, there's a lot of things that we could say. Obviously, Wilson Contreras and Ian Happ remain on the Cubs, and that's a whole show in and of itself that we could do on that topic. Surprising. And, and the thing is that you think about how the Cardinals have treated Molina and how he has been kind of that centerpiece of their team. And here's a guy in Wilson Contreras who is clearly open about wanting to be the centerpiece of the team, his love for Chicago, how he wants to be a part of the next great team. He's a 30-year-old guy in the prime of his career. He'll probably be there for the next 2 to 3 years at least. There's no reason to think that the Cubs can't build around Wilson Contreras. Now, granted, he's not as good a defensive catcher as Molina, but still, he's a guy that they can build around, and offensively, he's very good. And so, what are the odds that the Cubs try to re-sign or extend Wilson Contreras this year? And I mean, like, is it a failure if they don't?
I'll go in reverse order. I think it's a failure, if only because there's a lot of nuance to this, as there would be with anything, right? I struggle to believe that they did not get an offer for him that exceeded the value of. So let's assume they do not work an extension out with him in the last 2 months of the season. I think that's a fair assumption. They haven't had talks with him. I can get into some whole other. Okay, I got a bone to pick. I'm not going to name any names. You can go on my Twitter timeline.
Here we go.
But somebody was like, well, how do we know they didn't have talks with him? How do we know they were trying to trade Ian Happ? I'm like, I don't know, because they said it themselves. I mean, Wilson Contreras has said it. I said I personally reported that they were shopping Happ. Well, how do I know to trust your source? So I've been in the newspaper industry for blah, blah, blah. I was like, well, if you've been in the newspaper industry, you know how sources work. I'm not just going to reveal who it was that told me this. And it's like, well, I'm not questioning. Yes, you are questioning me.
Speaking of sources,
absolutely questioning me.
I just need to say one thing yesterday is Michael Cerami, who has broken some news in the past, tried to break the Mikael Givens. I think it was Mikael Givens trade. Mikael. I'm going to pronounce it the way I want to.
He's not Russian.
But he did it like 3 minutes after it was broken by Andy Martino. That was funny. So I had to, at least there was something to laugh at yesterday. So I had to just throw that in there. But yeah, I mean,
but it's funny, right? Because I'm like, listen, I don't do a ton of, if I break something, if I report something, if I have some sourced information, like, first of all, I'm very careful to protect that source. Now, there are some of them that you could probably go back in hindsight and understand where some of the stuff came from, but I'm not going to go out there and say it. But I'm also I'm not John Heyman. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not putting something out there to help the Mets or whatever, right? Or to try to guide the trade market. I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
Like, the Cubs were shopping Ian Happ. That's absolutely a fact. They were absolutely shopping Wilson Contreras and taking offers. There's zero doubt on that. They have not had talks with Wilson Contreras on an extension. That's been reported. Contreras himself has said it, whatever. So back to my point. So they'll probably hit him with a qualifying offer. That would give them a pick after competitive balance round B, which takes place after the second round. And I don't know how many teams, they haven't figured out how many will be revenue sharing recipients, but I think this past season it was 8. So if you look at that, then there's round A, round B, and then the 2 primary rounds. So that's 78. 78 picks. So it'd be after that. So you're looking at pick 79 at best, right? That's a third rounder. That's not a whole lot. You'd think they'd be able to do better than a third rounder. They got a number. The guy Ben Brown is their number 11 overall prospect rated now, right? Again, after what I just said, ascribe to that whatever weight you want. But they were able to get that for David Robertson. I have to think they would have gotten much better than that for Wilson Contreras, right? But their cost was obviously, or their price was obviously very high. So we look at all those things and factor all that stuff in there. If I'm Wilson Contreras and I've gone at this point, if I'm him, I definitely want to test that free agency market. However, the combination of the qualifying offer and then something I've been talking about for a while now is the fact that they've been using him a lot at DH. And we and I had theorized at the time, this was a couple months ago, that using him so frequently at the DH, a quarter, a third or so of his plate appearances was going to devalue him. And my thought at the time was like, as they're going in, if they go into extension talks or if they want to talk to him in free agency, that is a way that they could devalue him by saying, hey, great, you are a catcher, but really, if you're not spending all your time back there as a catcher and your best offensive performance has actually been as a DH. So we think that we should pay you a little bit less, or we think, this is where the value comes in. Right?
Is that a Jed Hoyer thing or a David Ross thing? Because I tend to think it's David Ross.
It was, it's both, but that's part of it. But I'm saying in general, I think if they're saying, but he's also defensively, he isn't as good a catcher with some of those things, right? So it balances both ways. I'm not saying that's the primary reason they're doing it, but I'm saying it's more of
it's definitely an impact.
Yeah, and so again, the combination of the qualifying offer and the fact that he's doing a bunch of DHing, and eventually we'll see kind of catching. We heard reports, right? There was a lot of reporting out there that other teams were wary of trading big bucks for him or big prospects for him because they were a little bit worried about how he might mesh with the pitching staff, how he'd be calling games and defensively impacting games, things like that. So his value has been hurt a little bit there. And the reason I say that is I think it might give the Cubs a little bit of a better chance to be able to re-sign him because they will be the only team that doesn't have to give up a qualifying offer pick to sign him.
And they're going to have conversations with him now, right? I mean, I know they haven't, but you got to think, listen, if you're Jed Hoyer, Tom Ricketts, whoever's making the call, you should be making that call today to his agent, right? Hey, we need to talk. That call should happen immediately. At what point does the Cubs front office start to look at things like loyalty and commitment to their players instead of this is all just a business? We get it. We know to you it's a business. But the thing is that to the fans, it's not a business. I don't know many fans who watch baseball and are fans of their teams because they enjoy the business of baseball. That's not why people watch. That's not why we're doing this podcast. That's not why we run a website. We do these. That's not why I was happy that Wilson Contreras wasn't traded, because I'm a fan of the game. I like the players. I like the teams. I love the rivalries. I love the ambiance, everything that has to do with baseball. That's why we watch. Yeah. And so it seems like this ownership that Ricketts, maybe it's just Ricketts, maybe it's Hoyer, whoever, has lost touch with the fact that this is not just a business. You can keep saying that as much as you want, but it doesn't mean that the fans are ever going to get behind that.
But they're trying. But at the same time, they're trying to run it based on their advertising, and it's different here. They're trying to sell you on the idea that it is the ambiance, that it is being at Wrigley and being a part of this. But they're not running baseball operations in the same manner, right? As you mentioned,
they want us to love Wrigley Field, which Tom Ricketts owns, but they don't want us to love the players. They want us to love the players when they're on the Cubs.
Yeah,
but then when they're gone, understand it's a business,
right?
When they're getting rid of them.
But if you listen to Contreras' quotes right before, he was talking about, he was in tears coming to terms with he had both thought they had played their last games at Wrigley, thought they had played their last game for the Cubs. They're hugging.
Yeah.
The way he was addressing it, and Contreras literally said, I'm trying to distance myself or trying to not get too close to my teammates because I'm pretty sure I'll be gone. Right? Like he thought he was going to be traded. He was certain he was going to be traded. So that's what I'm saying. They were definitely shopping him. The difficult part then is does he look at that and say, because there's two things. He can want to be in Chicago. And a lot of people, here's what I hate about it too, though, is when fans turn it around on the players. They say, well, if he really wanted to be here, he would sign for less. That is a bullshit thing to say, right?
Yeah,
I hate that so much. Like he is entitled to go out and try to earn as much as he possibly can. That might be with the Cubs. But if I'm him, part of it you say, he does love Chicago. He loves being part of the Cubs. It's clear that he was happy about it. But that in and of itself does not mean that he wants to just go ahead and immediately sign with them rather than testing free agency. But again, the qualifying offer being in there could harm those things. Now, the question is whether with the Cubs, if putting a qualifying offer on him would then enable them or give them the freedom to go out and maybe pursue a Carlos Rodon or someone like that who also has a qualifying offer because they would at least get a compensatory pick for the one they'd have to give up. So I'm interested in some of those. I just don't know, though. On one hand, I say, yes, this absolutely, from a procedural standpoint, absolutely opens up the door because now he's still there. They have that additional 2 months with him, plus, and I don't anticipate a whole bunch going on there, but they've got the week there or whatever it is at the end of the season where you can have exclusive negotiations with your own players, right, to where they could try to work something out prior to him hitting free agency, and knowing that, his value may have taken a bit of a hit and certainly will if he's got a QO attached, that they might be able to get a bigger bargain on him than they would have otherwise. But to go all the way back to your initial question, I feel like if all they get out of this is a QO comp pick, qualifying offer, compensatory pick, just to make sure I'm saying that so everybody can understand what I'm talking about, and they don't end up getting him, right? If they don't end up keeping him, but at the same time, I wonder, and I think it was Tommy Myers, Full Count Tommy on Twitter was kind of addressing this as well. I just wonder if they're not trying to head in a totally different direction from a catching perspective, right? Wilson Contreras, great offensive catcher, but realistically, there's a reason that they are time sharing so much of the catching duties. And while I know a lot of people are talking about, hey, automatic strike zones come in, framing's not as important, but I do think there are things, if you just mentioned it, look how much emphasis they have placed on the pitchers they're bringing in. And think about those, it wasn't a surprise. It's not, there's more reason to it than why David Ross was brought in to catch. I mean, David Ross was there before Willie came up, but that he was catching John Lester. There's a reason Victor Caratini was catching Yu Darvish, right? Certain of these pitchers might not mesh as well with him. And if they're really looking to base this very heavily on these young pitchers they have coming in and really trying to build that staff up to be a greater force than what it has been, I could see them trying to go in a different direction, saying, hey, we'll try to find the offense elsewhere. We're really trying to get this Jedi of Chicago there, kind of the Astros model. We can look around the Rays by and large have done some of this stuff to where they're trying to maximize their pitching staff with the catcher versus trying to maximize the lineup with the catcher. And for that reason, I can't imagine them not giving him
Contreras can play in the outfield. He has played in the outfield.
Yeah, but he won't with the guys they got coming up. They've got so many outfielders coming up.
Yeah,
he could stay at DH. Exactly. Like I could see them though, but if they were to, but that's what I'm saying.
Play first base.
Yeah, I could only see it happening. Matt Mervis is going to be at first base for the foreseeable future. That's my call there. But I could see them again approaching and saying, "Here's our plan."
Trade some of these guys. Right?
Oh yeah, no, they're going to have to.
Assuming that these guys turn into major league ready guys. I mean,
I'm surprised they didn't move Wisdom. I'm almost shocked they didn't move Wisdom. To be honest with you, Ortega, not shocked, but kind of surprised that there wasn't a taker there. And Drew Smiley is another one, right? Like expiring contract. You picked him up specifically for that reason. Now I don't think you were getting much in return, but like what the hell? Take a player to be named later. Take a low, but at that point, it goes back to Stroman wasn't getting moved just because he hasn't given enough.
His
He's been
value is
awesome
just
lately,
so low right
but
now. It's just
the
not worth
value
getting.
isn't. They wouldn't get nearly
And
enough
they have
back
him on a multi-year
for the
deal.
control they've got. But I think that what really comes into play is when they eliminated all the affiliates a couple years ago, and then capped your total affiliated roster at 180. That the real squeeze now becomes. So we saw how they went so heavy on pitchers because they already had plenty of position players, right? And there will come a time when they're going to have to purge some guys from the system, unfortunately, because they don't have enough. And so what you really have to look at is not so much can we get anything in return for Smiley? Because honestly, nobody out there is like, oh shit, man, we better have Drew Smiley making some strong starts the second half of the season. Literally anyone would be more valuable to the system than what Smiley will provide in the last 2 months. But
both Smiley and Miley are on 1-year deals, right?
Right.
And yeah, so
but
it's just
the
kind of
key
like
there with Smiley, the key is this player you get back more valuable to the organization long term than what Smiley will be, because that's a solid yes, no matter who it is. The key is that person better than Smiley, plus what you lose in the player that you're going to have to cut from your organization to stay under that 180-man limit. And so in that regard, I can understand why he wasn't moved. Again, wisdom to me, though, and a lot of people, everybody like, oh, 220 average. Like, okay, but look at his home runs and look at his ISO from May 25th of last year when he came up to now, and he's among like the top 15 power hitters in the entire league. He is probably was outside of, the Soto, but if you look at just a pure power hitter, there wasn't a better one available on the market. And to me, that's where it's like you saw Joey Gallo get traded, right? Power hitter who's batting 159 and not hitting for much power. You telling me the Cubs couldn't have moved Wisdom to the Dodgers or somewhere to have gotten something like that's where I would see, and that's where I was a little bit surprised, knowing the guys they've got coming up. That's some of the things I'm seeing. So I think as we zoom out, we apply context. I get it. I just don't know. The Cubs are in a better position from a pitching standpoint, but
they better be.
They couldn't really be worse. But this was one of those touchstones. I said the draft, as I laid them out, it'd be the draft and then the trade deadline. I don't know about you, but I don't feel that anything became any more clear to me in terms of their direction. I don't feel that they
I would say
any wind
the
one way or the other.
Clarity began before the draft. To me, when they drafted 16 pitchers, and now all the trades they made, except Zach McKinstry, but all the prospects that they traded for were pitchers. And so to me, that does clarify the situation a lot. It obviously tells us that they were clearly focused on getting pitchers back, whereas last year they were more focused on the positional guys. I mean, if you look, and I think that to a certain extent, the 2021 kind of jaded these guys a little. Maybe, it hurt them, I think, in this year because they did so well last year. And so their expectations were real high. The rest of Major League Baseball, I think, has had a chance to look at the trades that the Cubs made. And granted, none of the players have really made an impact on the Major League roster yet, but their prospects they've got, 6 top 20 prospects that they traded for last season, 4 top 10. And the Mets were feeling, I think, real bad about the Pete Crow-Armstrong deal. I really think the Mets shot themselves in the foot.
The Mets are so freaking stupid.
The fact that they wouldn't trade for Wilson Contreras, a player that they really needed, because they made such a terrible trade. I mean, listen, they traded for Javier Baez and Trevor Williams and cash, and they gave up Pete Crow-Armstrong, who is the Cubs' number 3 ranked prospect and looking like he's going to be a stud.
He may well be number 1, yeah.
And yeah, depending on what happens with Brennan Davis. But, I get it. I get that could make you as an organization kind of, rethink, but there's no point in relitigating the past, right? I mean, you have to look forward. And for the Mets, their time is now. I mean, they have the ability to screw things up better than any team I've ever seen. They either are really good in the first half and then they nosedive in the second half, but they're not doing that this year. I mean, they're still really good, although the Braves are right on their tail. But they should make the wild card. And at the end of the day, they really needed Wilson Contreras. And the fact that they didn't pull the trigger on that says a lot about the mental kind of being of the New York Mets. And if I'm a Mets fan, I am just so annoyed. They didn't really do anything to improve their organization at all, short of Michael Givens.
Yeah, there we go. Well, Jacob deGrom did come back and start last night, and he threw 102. So miles per hour, that is, not 102 pitches. But
of course, but their starting pitching
nice
was already
boost.
good.
Yeah. Well, but that's what's wild to me, and what's really funny, right? And we've known this about the Mets for a while. It was again reported by multiple people yesterday, but it had been reported and theorized for a while that they were still stinging from that Pete Crow Armstrong deal, and that was causing them not to even approach the Cubs ask, right? That we knew that was going to be the case. And it was hilarious because I wrote something about it, and a Mets fan responded to it and was really upset about it because, like, I was interpreting things a certain way. I'm like, I'm not interpreting anything. The tweet included in the post from Andy Martino, who covers the Mets, said very literally that they're still stinging from that PCA deal. Stephanie Epstein tweeted about it last night. Like, that is, for an organization that is willing to spend hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, exceeding all levels of the luxury tax, for them to be afraid to trade away a prospect or two in order to get a guy who's only making $10 million. And, so you're only paying him like $3.5 million for the rest of the season, who would markedly upgrade your offense. Like, that
makes no sense.
It is wild to me that did not happen. And I think there's when you get to it, and I think that's part that, people are like, well, did the Cubs overplay? Did they overvalue? I do think there were probably some things that the Cubs anticipated that didn't come to pass. Part of that was, hey, San Diego was a team that was in talk to possibly trade for like Happ and Contreras
and that
Robertson.
Really killed it too. I mean, if the Padres don't get Santana, I think Contreras ends up on the
Soto?
Padres. All right, that's right. Sorry, Soto. But Soto, I was surprised the Dodgers didn't pull the trigger there.
Yeah, well, to let that happen, I didn't think St. Louis was for real. Once we started hearing the names of St. Louis, and they were like, well, they don't really want to include this mediocre outfielder in this deal. I'm like, okay, St. Louis is unserious in this pursuit. But what also surprised me was, like, the Dodgers' primary response to that was to trade for Joey Gallo, and they had reportedly been in on Happ. So I do think the Cubs, probably, the Blue Jays
probably
were reportedly
got Gallo
in on Happ
for a lot
they
less.
I don't
know what they gave.
They got Merrifield, and that's what I was saying. I think we were talking off air before this that I think the Soto deal shook everything up so badly that nobody wanted to be like, because it was such a drop off from that, and they got Josh Bell, who's another one of the better hitters who was available on the market. But that was, Soto is so good that any move you make relative to that would be like if you or I got in the ring with a heavyweight fighter, and then he just popped you square in the face. I'm just going to lay down on him. Like, I'm not even taking a swing at the dude after that because it's not going to matter relative to what he just dropped on me, right? I'm just going to lay down, and then I from the corner I might hug him or something and try to get him in the kidney. But clearly the market was not there, and I think they overestimated that the Mets would eventually be spurred to wake up, right, and come to their senses and be like, shit, yeah, okay, we do need to actually deal. And they didn't. I think that was a big part of it, honestly, is there was no sense of desperation on the Mets' part to up their offer.
Which is really weird considering they haven't had any real success in 30 years.
I mean, they went to the World Series in 2015, right? And they went whenever that was, the Subway Series there. But that's been very fleeting.
They have not won, right?
Yeah, but they got really good for that 1 year and then completely fell off, right? Whereas the Cubs at least sustained that for a few, and so I think there were a number of things going on there. I guess the question for me though is, and when I say I don't think we got any additional clarity, I mean, I know we got clarity in terms of the Cubs are absolutely trying to do a much better job. Big pitchers. Big bodies, like they're drafting and trading for guys for 6'6", 6'7", 6'8", big frames, durable, hard throwers, electric stuff. But I think in terms of the clarity on any sort of a timeline, right? They're still kind of all over the map there. Now we could look at that and say they're going to flip the script from the first time and they're going to develop their pitching and go pay for free agents. But in not moving any of those guys out and not clearing any of that room right away, they didn't really open up, again, trading Wisdom or Ortega and guys like that and just clearing space for some young guys to come up. We didn't see them do that. They traded for a couple guys who were close to major league ready. So there is that. McKinstry is playing. He's been in the lineup. Wisniewski could very well be up here later in August or even in September. They've got Caleb Killian. So we see that. To me, though, I don't see anything that has happened to show me. I see them buying lumber. I don't see them laying out the plans for the new porch that they're building in the backyard. I guess I'll say that.
But to your point, they're really at a tipping point.
Yes.
I mean, it's just they are at the point where they've got so many prospects in their system that if you bring a prospect in, you're going to have to let one go, and you're starting to run out of guys who you can let go. And you could really see a situation where if the Cubs bring on many more prospects, the guys that they are letting go are guys that are MLB guys in the next whenever. They're prospects, right, who can become major league ready players. And what you don't want to do is you don't want to give up a guy who then ends up being a stud somewhere else. And that can happen, and it has happened. And so that's where you're at this tipping point where it's like, all right, you got to look at what you've done and kind of what's in your breadbasket, so to speak, and start rolling things out and bringing these guys up. And I think it's got to start in August and September here. I mean, you mentioned Wisniewski. He's got to come up, I think. There's no reason not to bring him up. And other guys, Killian definitely got to come up. What are other guys? What are position players that you think could come up? And I just want to add one thing. I just, as much as Patrick Wisdom has power and all those things, I wouldn't listen. I'm not going to be heartbroken if they DFA him. And I certainly won't be heartbroken if they DFA Frank Schwindel. I just don't see the point of those guys on the active roster on the team right now. I think it's better
there's
to
no
bring
reason
up prospects.
They could get something for Wisdom. Again, a team that
because they have control over him, right?
Right. They've got plenty of control. The thing with him
but they didn't.
Again, right. And that's that. But again, that is what is weird to me because he has a marketable skill. Overall, not great on a team like the Cubs that isn't good. He's effectively like a position player version of a closer, right? Like the power is great. That's very good to have in your lineup and on your roster. But when your team is bad, there's not as much value to it. But if you have a team that is in contention, and I ran it down, like when I wrote the piece about them, if you look at like all these contending teams, there's a bunch of them that are in the bottom. San Diego's one of them. Obviously, they just changed their offensive profile. The Guardians are up there. The White Sox, some of these that just haven't hit enough homers. And it's like, if you could just get a little bit of power for a fairly low cost, both in terms of the prospect return and his salary, right? Because he's not even arbitration eligible yet. That's the kind of
three
guy
options left.
Yeah. And so there's not as much value to the Cubs because by the time they have a team that's ready, well, they're going to be filling some guys in there. So, I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like, as I look at it and I look at like, I look at a Matt Mervis, right, who I've already mentioned. We've talked about a bunch on the show. I mean, I think he's one because you've already got Velasquez and Morel up there, right? There's obviously Brennan Davis would have been another one, but and Suzuki. I mean, there are young.
The outfield does feel pretty
for a long time.
It's like,
yeah, and I mean, Hap's there for another year. If they don't want to move that, there's not that many. I mean, Nico Horner's already there at short, and I mean, if you want to move Morel in at second, like you could do that. But McKinstry's kind of playing over there. Morel's been out, so like he moves around, and that's fine. But
to me, it's first and third, though. I mean, those are the two positions that are kind of most available to slot players in. You mentioned Mervis. Would love to see him up. I'm not sure what's going to happen with Alfonso Rivas. He just hasn't seemed to click in any way, shape, or form, but he's got a lot of potential. But there comes a point where he's back down now. He got sent down yesterday, I think, right?
Yeah, he
When
just
they
got
made
optioned.
all those moves.
Yeah.
And so maybe he stays down at AAA for a while. That probably makes sense. But I don't like what's the timeline in terms of Bryce Ball?
He's still he's got. I mean, he's at AA, but he's got a couple more years. But I mean, he's a DH, so he's got some time yet. I mean, he's not. He's I don't know if they'll pull him up, try to do some time at AAA. I figure he spends next year at AAA. Maybe you see him bounce up and down a little bit, but he's not really much of a first baseman, and so I think he's definitely a dude who you're looking at, like getting a little bit of help on the DH side, being kind of that slugger if you need him. I don't see a whole lot that's going on there.
Yeah, and then Madrigal, that's another name. They've just this guy. I mean, he did well. He's a guy that, like, I'd stash him in AAA, to be honest with you. I mean, let him work out whatever he's working out. He batted 309 in the 12 games he was down there. So he didn't really do terrible, but he's just on this team. He serves absolutely no purpose whatsoever. I mean, I don't see the value of Madrigal in any way, shape, or form. I think that was just chalk that trade up to a loss. That was a Kimbrel trade. They got Cody Hoyer, who they – didn't they DFA Hoyer? Was it last year?
He had Tommy John surgery.
Oh, it was Tommy John. Okay, I'm thinking of one of the other guys they traded. Maybe it was Diekman.
No, Dykman's still around.
But they DFA'd him, right?
Oh yeah, but he accepted his assignment,
And
so he's still
came back.
Yeah, yep.
And so, but Madrigal's a bust. I mean, he just is, right? I mean, he what's the value?
Yeah, I mean, if he's not batting 350, I mean, maybe not that high, but I mean, that was the whole thing. Is he's supposed to bat 300 plus and never strike out, but he has zero power. I mean, there's just absolutely nothing that he.
Another one. He's got speed.
Yeah, no, well, not when you keep pulling your groin or your hamstring or whatever every week or two.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have power in Major League Baseball, you better have speed
or play exceptional defense. Or something.
Both.
And part of the reason he's not hitting as well as he has in the past is because he has no power. So opposing defenses are cheating in on him like crazy. I think we mentioned this a few weeks back. Like, they're just playing him so shallow, and they're not letting him get those little singles in front of him. Well, guess what? He doesn't have the ability to go past him. He's not putting anything in the gap. So unless he figure, like, the only way he survives as a major league player and is he has got to do something to revamp his offensive approach. He doesn't need to put everything over the wall, but he's got to figure out a way to go gap to gap.
Chalk are like fingernails on a chalkboard to me. He does the same thing that Hayward does, where he does this thing. Where he does, it's not like just a normal swing, right? He goes up there and he's like, "What is that?" You know how Hayward does that too, like his practice swings.
Oh yeah,
they're just. I've never understood a practice swing that doesn't mimic your actual swing.
Yeah, it
just drives me nuts.
I'm more driven nuts by his actual swings because they don't yield much of anything. But it just has to change, Obviously there just needs to be something different there, but you can't.
We have someone just tuning in now. Where did they trade Hap to?
Hap got traded to he got traded to
Kansas City.
No, I thought it was NPB. I thought he got traded to Japan.
Here it is. Where they okay, they spelled they with an A and then don't have an E on the end of trade, and then two.
Yeah, he went to Japan. They got him. That was the player to be named later in the Seiya Suzuki signing. They were required to send him.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on. So I mean, it's just the Cubs did really well in 2021. They stocked their system, and I would even argue they did pretty well in 2022. they didn't trade the guys we expected them to trade, but the guys that they got back, I mean, Ben Brown, Hayden Wisniewski, and they picked up Kervin Castro off waivers from the Giants. That's an interesting one. I mean, it's a guy, there's no risk there other than like displacing someone. But Kervin Castro, I don't know a lot about him, but when I looked at his numbers, they weren't bad. Let me look. So he's got well, this year hasn't been great, but it's in 18, 19, 21. He had a sub 3 ERA in the rookie level, A level, and even AAA. I think this season he's kind of struggled a little bit. He's got a 5.57 ERA. And then for the Giants, he's only pitched 1.2 innings. So you really can't take much from there. But there's a guy that's got some potential. He's what is he, a right-handed 6', 185 guy? Chances are you're probably going to see him up this year. So
Alexander Canario is on the 40-man already. I mean, he could come up. There's a few guys.
Ranked prospect.
Yeah, it depends on how it goes. So, I mean,
an outfielder.
Yeah, and I'm not. I'm certainly not. I want to say this the right way because I don't want it to sound like, man, I wish Happ and Contreras were gone so we could see more prospects. But it does also feel like it feels kind of weird in that. And again, Happ and Contreras still being there is not part of the original plan. So I do think we need to understand that part of it is like that. And that's why I feel like there's not as much clarity because the Cubs fully intended on trading both of them. It wasn't like this was the desired outcome. You know what I mean? Like this is absolutely not what they had expected to have happen. So I think that's a bit of it. And part of that is like having them there makes them this weird sort of, they're still bad, but they can be quasi-mediocre, as we saw when they won 6 straight games, right? They lost 9 straight right before that, and they got thumped in the first game back. But now you've got all these other teams jettisoned most of their good players, and so now the Cubs really have no realistic shot at one of those top 3, or the top 3 odds. And so that's where I'm getting at is like, okay, if you're going to do this, you go do it. But now you held on. It's like I feel like there's half measures. I feel like there's half measures that they're taking now, and that makes sense. That gets you into trouble.
But I think much like what you were talking about earlier with getting a prospect in return for a major league guy is like you can't say whether you've won the trade yet, and similar in this situation, you can't say that they've messed it up yet. Because we haven't seen how it plays out. Now, if they go and they extend Wilson Contreras, I think that's the right move here. No matter what you do, obviously you don't want to overpay for him, and that's going to be the key. And it's going to be, can they negotiate with Wilson Contreras before he becomes a free agent, or are they going to have to negotiate with him as a free agent? If Contreras wants to wait until he becomes a free agent, then the Cubs are going to lose leverage, obviously. And that might not work out as well. But I think, like I said earlier, if Jed Hoyer makes a call to his agent and says, let's talk, and they get the ball rolling and they work out an extension that's not anything too crazy, that can then turn into something that you can trade if you need to at some point in the future, which hopefully you don't. But, and we're talking about what,
but 5 years. He's going to want a no trade. He's going to want a no trade clause. Like I don't think he's going to sign something without
especially
it.
after this.
Right.
So what, like, 5 years, 5 years, no trade clause. There's value to that. Yeah. 5 years, 85 million.
I bet that would get it done, especially if he's got a QO attached to him. That's going to devalue him in the face of those other teams that would have to part with the player.
So it would seem now's the time, because for Contreras, like, you're probably not going to get more than what the Cubs are going to offer you, even if you feel like it's a little bit below market, because your market's already been hurt by the QO that's out there, right?
Well, that's what I was going to say. I don't think they lose any leverage.
Interesting approach. If the Cubs don't screw this up, they could actually. I mean, Just think of like the fan reaction if the Cubs announce an extension for Wilson Contreras. I mean, after all we've been through since 2016 and the heartbreak, the fact the Cubs didn't even make the playoffs one year, they made the playoffs because they made the wild card and then got beat by the Marlins. It just, or who they got beat by the Rockies in the. It's so hard to remember, but then they made the playoffs. Was it 20?
The Rockies, they got beaten in the wild card. That was in
they lost to the Marlins
season,
in the
and then the
division
20
series.
season was the Marlins. Yeah, 20 was the Marlins in the division where they scored like no runs. And I sat on a rooftop and watched the most boring game in history, at least that I've attended, sort of.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the thing is,
a lot has happened.
If they extend Contreras, that also is a signal that they're willing to spend, that they're willing to start building back again. And
they need to be doing that. I mean, they got the Padres spending way more than they're spending. I mean, it's just like, it doesn't make any sense. And so at some point, you have to turn things around. And that's where I said earlier, this is the tipping point, because this really is a tipping point. It's like, you know what? You have done well enough. Your prospects are good. You just drafted 16 pitchers. You just traded for several more pitchers. You don't
there's
need
only so much room.
more.
There's only so much room in the system. Like, they're going to need to start pulling some trades just so they can clear it out, you know?
Yes.
If they don't, that's what I was saying. I was like, I still don't see, right now, because my four touchstone points, the one was this draft, then it was a trade deadline, it's the off season, and it's the following draft. Now that following draft might not matter at all if we see them go after it this off season, but a Wilson Contreras extension will be the part of that, because that does signal, because if that happened, now I had thought that signing Marcus Stroman and getting Seiya Suzuki was also going to be the start of something, because the thing was those signings both signaled, all right, this is the start of it, because that's not enough. We still need to do more. So clearly, as we've seen, having Wilson Contreras is not nearly enough, but having him under contract is another step in that direction of, okay, we are another step closer to solidifying more of a core. Now we go out and we have to add to it meaningfully. And if that doesn't do it, right, okay, so let me ask you this. Do you feel, let's say if the Cardinals had gotten Soto, do you feel that would have accelerated the Cubs'
glad that didn't happen.
growth, like as a response to that? And if so, or if not, do you feel that Soto going to San Diego and not to St. Louis will cause the Cubs to do you? Long story short, do you think the Cubs are doing anything based on the things that are happening in St. Louis and or Milwaukee in terms of saying, well, they didn't go get him, now we can bide our time for a little bit longer? Or do they look at it and say, they didn't get him, now we've got a better opportunity to go and really make a splash and get better?
Because the goal is to win a World Series, not just a division title. And so I hope that that's not their baseline. I hope that obviously you've got to win the division first. But listen, if your goal is to win the World Series, that means you're trying to be better than every other team in Major League Baseball. That's what they should be doing, and that's how they should be looking at it.
I would like to think so. I would certainly like to think so.
And I'm just saying they have the pieces in place to do that now. There's no excuse. If you handed this to a GM and said, here, this is what you have to work with. This is the budget you have to work with, which for the Cubs, it should be over $200 million.
That's really what we got to hope for. If they have a $200 million budget, I mean, think about the damage they could do with that in the offseason.
That's what
there's $100 million to go spend, Jed. Go get it done, right?
You can't continue doing what they're doing.
No.
And so you only get a pass for so long. And it's really annoying to me when they show a Tuesday day game that's got, 35,000 people all. I get it. I get that you want to go to the game. I get that people want to have fun. But at some point as fans, we need to pull back, because we're the ones who are making it okay for them to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And we're the ones that are giving them the pass. As long as we continue to buy tickets, as long as we continue to buy hats and shirts and all the other stuff, they're going to continue to do this, because Tom Ricketts is like, well, this is great. I don't have to spend any money and I'm still making just as much, maybe a little bit less. But, I mean, they're getting revenue share,
but at a lower baseline cost.
Deals.
Yeah, because you can't guarantee how many fans are going to show up, but you know exactly what your baseball payroll is. So that's your fixed cost. And then it's just like, hey, man, as long as I'm making this extra money, and you know clearly, and they have not reached the point of elasticity yet to where that rubber band is snapping, because they're playing like crap and they're not paying a whole bunch for the payroll, and they're still seeing people show up, not in the same numbers as they should. And there are times when you look up in the corners and it's definitely lighter than what it should be, and people are getting there a little bit later and leaving a little earlier and that sort of thing. And so there are obviously some opportunity costs that they're missing out on there, but it is not, it can't go through another year, because if this happens all over again, and you've got
we can't go through another year.
That would be awful. But like say Contreras doesn't get re-signed, and now Happ is in his walk year, and Hendricks is in his walk year, and Hayward finally will be he can't be moved. That part doesn't really matter, but it's like it's going to happen all over again, and then it's just going to be another matter of going through and who are they going to sell. Like the Chicago Cubs cannot go through 3 consecutive seasons of selling off every single player who is available to be traded and has any value. Like, they just cannot do that. Will they or won't they? I don't know.
In order for Ricketts to get all the property he got outside of Wrigley, in order for him to get, all the rooftops and all the different things that he got, he sold Cubs fans on the rebuild will happen once, and then the Cubs are going to always be competing. And granted, Theo Epstein was there too, but Theo wasn't going off saying things that Tom Ricketts wasn't also saying. And it was, we're going to build a team that's going to compete year in and year out for a World Series. And that is not what's happening right now. It's not what's happened this year, last year. And it's definitely not what's going to happen next year. And so that's to your point, right? I mean, that's where at some point you have to acknowledge that you said these things, and that is not what we're getting as fans. And at some point, fans have to acknowledge that same thing back to ownership and say, listen, man, this is what you promised us.
Yeah.
And at this seems to be the point to me when I look at all these names that I have written down on this piece of paper that the Cubs have for prospects and who they've traded and everything else. This seems to be the point where we get what happened. We understand that you guys, but it's not our fault, not my fault. It's your fault. You guys didn't sign key pieces that you could have signed. You didn't go out and spend money. You wanted to get down below the luxury tax threshold. That was all you. And so now we're in this position, and it's just I'm tired of it. I want to see some good prospects coming up. I'd love to see Alexander Canario come up. I would love to see Nick Madrigal stay in AAA. I want to see
he's active now. So it's like they snuck that in there kind of after all that other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, they had to activate him first, right? Well, I'm not sure what the procedure would be there, but
they had to, because he was doing a rehab stint, so they had to activate him and bring him up. So
yeah,
but
they could send him back down. He's got options.
Oh, they can, and they should, because there's just too many other spots. But yeah, I hope we get a look at some of these guys. And as I said, that's the only reason I don't think I finished my thought. But like, I didn't want to see Contreras gone from a personal standpoint. Right now, from a procedural and organizational standpoint, I felt like that's what they're geared up for. But part of that also means, okay, there's 2 spots that you're calling prospects up into, that you can shuffle some guys in there and possibly get a look at some different players. And so, that's part of it. But yeah, something has to happen, because these guys will start to have to come up. You've got a farm system that's starting to get really, really stocked, and that top 20 is getting a lot more. You can't more heavily populate a list of 20. You can only ever have 20 people on it, but it's much more balanced. Much more balanced after adding a couple of pitchers in there. When it gets updated, the top 2 pitchers that they drafted and signed, those guys are going to probably move into their top 20. So now you have what was a very, very heavily imbalanced toward the position players balances out, and it's very, very deep as well. Outside of those top 3 to 5, there's not a great deal of difference. I mean, you go starting from 5 or 6 down on to about 20. There's not, and again, we talk about Mervis all the time. He's not a guy who's in that top 30 on MLB.com. probably move up, and he's been moving up like Baseball America, some of the other ones because of the performances he's had. But it's a very, very deep system that I think they will be able to deal from like extensively, right, without materially harming it, and without really cutting off the timeline as far as guys coming up. So that's, I think, what we got to see. In addition to free agency, if they can go out there and make some moves, whether it's with the Marlins, right, whether it's with some other teams out there for controllable, like young, proven starters who are still controllable, that still has not really happened. We haven't seen them be able to do anything like that. So whether they do that or go after them in free agency, they have avenues. They have the money, or they should. They have the prospects, you know, to be able to go and make that happen. And if they don't, to me, more than anything, I keep saying it's already been there, but if it doesn't happen this offseason, that is just an absolutely unforgivable failure on the part of ownership to provide the resources that are necessary to turn this team into a winner, because it can be done in relatively short order, and it should be done. And if it's not, people really need to be very, very pissed off and need to express that in a way that Tom Ricketts understands.
Well, and you look at the division. I mean, there's the Brewers, they have a good pitching staff, but offensively, they've got holes, major holes. The Cardinals, you know, have two good offensive guys, but they're not great. You know, this is a winnable division. And I think that's what the Cubs need to be looking at next season is how do we win this division? I mean, that has to be the conversation. It should be the conversation starting right now. How do we win the division next year? How do we put the pieces in place to win the division and to get to the playoffs next season? And I think if they do that and they make the moves that make sense on that path, you're going to have a lot of fans very happy, and you will fill the stands, even if the Cubs are bad for the remainder of the next 2 months, because people want to see that. And they want to hear a commitment, and that's what we're not getting.
I guess that's where I get, like, there still has never once. They've said, now they said they'll have the resources. Like that was both both Jed Hoyer and Tom Ricketts said the resources would be there to build a competitive team prior to this season, right? They said that. Now, again, I get it. The lockout and all that stuff really messed with things, but we still have not heard. And I don't think they should say, I don't expect them to say, we're going to go out and sign. We're going to spend $75 million in free agency, and we're going to try to sign a shortstop and a center fielder. And next year we will be competitive. I don't expect that, but at least with what Theo Epstein was saying when he blew into town originally was like, hey, listen, it's going to be tough for these first few years. We're having to rebuild everything from the start. We're having to clean this stuff out, restart it, find new ways to do this and build this back up. And we, you know, it was like a 5-year kind of a thing that we all kind of figured it out. But right now, we don't have any idea. It feels,
well, the level of transparency
uninformed.
is just not there,
right?
Like it was when Theo first came into town. And as you mentioned, I mean, the circumstances were way different, right? And so that's easy to understand, but now the circumstances are pretty similar, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you look at what they've done, granted, you didn't want to show your hand, but at this point, I mean, it's all the cards are on the table.
Right, you're past the trade deadline, and there's no waiver trades anymore. So it's not like you're trying to protect anything from value of what you're getting. Like, it's just been so nebulous that they're not presenting anything that they have to be held accountable to, and that kind of stinks. It's tough, right?
And it feels like they're doing that on purpose.
Oh, they're definitely doing it on purpose, right? I think part of it is like, and that's where I also look back and I say, well, I still think it goes back to, you know, a fish rots from the head down. But I think a lot of it's like Jed Hoyer cannot come out and say, listen, we have been absolutely hamstrung by a budget that is not amenable to creating a winner, right? He can't say that. So what do they say? Oh, we'll have the resources. And they say, well, you know, we'll have budget that'll roll over. To me, what that's saying is the budget wasn't actually there. They didn't actually get the money and have the money that they needed to go out and pursue these guys meaningfully that would have markedly improved this team from where it is right now. But it'll be there in the future because we know it doesn't truly roll over. But what we do know is the budget can increase year over year based on how things go. And so that's the only thing I think it's the only thing I can come back to is, again, they were not given the resources that were necessary, and they're just having to talk themselves around it. And because the budget is dictated to Hoyer, he can't simply come out and say, this is what I want to do and this is how we're going to do it, because he doesn't know until like November or whatever what he's actually going to have to spend.
Tom Ricketts is his boss, so he can't actually come out and say, well, Tom's not letting me do this or not letting me do that.
Because then he's not your boss anymore. Now you're finding a new boss. When you throw the boss under the bus, although Theo kind of hinted at quite a bit of that kind of on his way out. We would hear that certain ways, but that's the only thing I can come back to, right? And this isn't even to say Ricketts cheap, but I'm just saying when you put it all together, either that or you could say if they truly did come in way under budget and have money to roll over, then you can point to Jed and be like, what the hell were you doing? Why didn't you go do more with this? But I tend to lean more on the I don't really trust Crane Kenny as far as I can throw him. And I think when he comes out and says things, I don't really believe them. And so, again, I am led to believe they did not actually have the budget.
For like 20 years. Yeah. Hasn't he been there forever?
Right. Well, far too long. And that if the budget is increased to an acceptable level, right, and it should be $150 million. It should be $200 million, but 150 is too low, right? It should be 175. 200 is really where it needs to be.
It should be 200 to compete for the division.
Yeah. And they should be up against the luxury tax every year, right at it, whether they go over it a little bit and come back down or whatever, depending on what you got to do, if you got to pull a trade at the last minute or whatever. But if they have a $200 million budget, you can fix a whole hell of a lot of problems, because that gives you the ability to then really get more aggressive with your prospect development, get those guys up, try them out, see what happens. We saw that happen in 2015 and 16. They could make that happen in a hurry come free agency if they choose to do it. That's it.
And the other thing that's worth noting here is that Jed Hoyer is on the clock. If he wants to get a job again, and it's not for the Chicago Cubs, he needs to start having some success at the big league level.
Better do something with it.
Shown that. He's shown that he's good at pulling off trades to get prospects, but that doesn't really mean anything if that doesn't translate on the big league level. And so that's where, if you're Jed Hoyer, I mean, you have to start thinking about that at some point.
There's a reason.
What's my future look like?
He didn't show that in San Diego when he was there, right? And he left San Diego to come to join the Cubs. And again, Theo, and I know Jed had input into a lot of the things that they did, but Theo Epstein was the one calling the shots. And so again, we still have not really seen. I want to trust that he can do it. And I think we all feel good about the draft picks that have happened under Dan Kantrovitz. I think Jed has done a very good job of assembling a crew of lieutenants beneath him to make some of these decisions. But until he provides a winner at Wrigley Field, none of it matters. None of it matters.
Exactly.
And he needs money to do it.
So that's what we're up against. The Cubs come back to, they lost last night 6-0. They got crushed. They play the Cardinals tonight and tomorrow, and then they come back to Wrigley Field, 1:20 Friday game. Going to be neon tank top, Budweiser neon tank top giveaway on Friday, which is, I'm excited about Friday. I have to be honest with you, just to see the ovation I think that Wilson Contreras is going to get Friday afternoon game. I wish I was going to be there. There's a little part of me that is thinking about maybe trying to get out there just for the game, just because I think it's just going to be fun. You got Friday 1:20, Saturday 1:20, Sunday 1:20, right? I mean, doesn't get any better than that. Here, see, look at me. I'm selling the Cubs, even though they're losers. But
you're part of the problem.
For Wilson Contreras, I think it's going to be, I mean, he was so happy in his post-game interview. I mean, he was like a little kid. And you could just see the joy on his face, in his voice, the way he was just, he was lighting up like a candle. And so that was super cool. I think it's going to be awesome when he comes back on Friday to Wrigley Field. I think the ovation is going to be, it should be thunderous. Send Jed Hoyer and Tom Ricketts a message, Wrigley, that we love Wilson and we want him as part of the future.
There you go.
That is all I've got for today. I think that's a good note to end on, and we will circle back on. We could, probably not on Friday just because it's a 1:20 game, but we will circle back. Let's say Monday, August 8th after the Marlins series. The Cubs will be at home for 3 more to take on the Washington Nationals, starting with a night game at 7:05 Central on Monday. So
Cool.
that's when we'll see you next.
All right. Take it easy, folks.
All right. Thanks, everyone.